Hello and welcome back to the channel. Settle in tonight wherever you are. Dim the light if you can. Let your breathing slow and let the weight of the day drain out of your shoulders. Tonight we travel to a kingdom on the edge of the Asian continent, tucked into the southeastern corner of the Korean peninsula, where kings once wore crowns of pure gold shaped like branching trees, where the dead were buried beneath enormous mounds of earth that still rise gently from the modern city around them, and where a small, cautious kingdom slowly, patiently outlasted its rivals to unify an entire peninsula under a single crown. If you find comfort in these long, unhurried journeys into forgotten history, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so that new stories can find you in the quiet hours when you need them. And now, let the modern world fade away. Let's travel back many centuries to the kingdom of Silla. To understand Silla, we must first understand its geography, because geography shaped almost everything about this kingdom's long and careful history. The Korean peninsula stretches southward from the Asian mainland like a long, curved arm reaching toward Japan, bordered by mountains, rivers, and two very different seas. The Yellow Sea to the west, calmer and closer to China, and the East Sea, colder and more isolated, facing Japan across open water. Along this peninsula in ancient times, geography favored the rise of not one but several competing kingdoms, each shaped by the particular valleys, coastlines, and mountain passes it controlled. Silla began in the far southeast in a valley basin now known as Gyeongju, ringed by low mountains that offered natural protection, watered by a gentle river system that supported rice cultivation, and positioned close enough to the southern coast to permit trade and contact with neighboring peoples, yet far enough removed from the northern frontier to avoid the earliest and heaviest waves of continental conflict that troubled the peninsula's other kingdoms. This relative remoteness would prove, across the coming centuries, to be one of Silla's greatest quiet advantages. While two other kingdoms, Goguryeo in the north, vast and militarily powerful, controlling much of the peninsula along with large territories reaching into what is now Manchuria, and Baekje in the southwest, wealthy, cultured, and deeply connected by sea to southern China and to Japan, absorbed the earliest and most direct pressures of continental politics. Silla developed more slowly, tucked into its protected valley, building strength gradually rather than through early, dramatic expansion. According to the founding traditions later recorded in Korean chronicles, Silla began as a loose confederation of 6 village communities in the Gyeongju Basin, communities that gradually united under a single line of chiefs and eventually kings. The very earliest of these traditions blend history with legend in ways common to many ancient founding stories, accounts of a boy born from an egg, discovered in a forest, and raised to become the community's first king, a story that, whatever its literal truth, reflects the sacred authority that these early rulers claimed for themselves, an authority understood by their people as connected to heaven itself. For several centuries, this small kingdom in its mountain-ringed valley grew slowly, absorbing neighboring communities, refining its systems of governance, and developing the particular blend of political structure, religious belief, and artistic tradition that would eventually flower into one of the most sophisticated societies of early East Asia. Picture, if you will, that valley in its earliest centuries, terraced rice paddies catching the light of a low autumn sun, low mountains softening the horizon on every side, smoke rising from thatched village roofs, and somewhere near the center of the valley, a modest royal settlement, not yet the golden capital it would become, but already the seed from which that golden capital would grow. Before we go further, it is worth pausing to understand something unique about how Silla organized its society, because this system shaped nearly every aspect of the kingdom's political and cultural life across its long history. A strict hereditary ranking structure that later historians have come to call the bone rank system. Silla society was divided into rigid tiers of birth-based status, determined entirely by the purity and closeness of one's bloodline to the royal family. At the very top sat those of sacred bone status, individuals whose lineage was considered pure enough on both parents' sides to claim the throne itself. Below them came those of true bone status, still closely related to the royal line, eligible for the highest offices of state and military command, but not for the crown itself under strict interpretation of the system. Below these came a series of further ranks, each with strictly defined limits on what offices one could hold, what colors of clothing one could wear, what size of house one could build, even what materials could decorate a saddle or a bowl. This was not a subtle social preference, the way class distinctions might operate more flexibly in other societies. It was law enforced with remarkable rigidity across centuries. A person of lower rank, however talented, however wealthy, could not rise beyond the ceiling assigned to them by birth. A person of true bone status could not build a house exceeding a certain number of rooms, could not use certain colors of roof tile, could not decorate their garments with certain patterns reserved for those above them. It is easy, from a modern vantage point, to find such rigidity troubling, and indeed, many later Korean historians have identified this very rigidity as one of the eventual weaknesses that contributed to Silla's long-term decline, as talented individuals of lower rank found themselves permanently blocked from positions where their abilities might have served the kingdom well. And yet, for centuries, this same rigid system also provided Silla with a remarkable internal stability. Succession disputes, so common and so destabilizing in many ancient kingdoms, were narrowed by clear rules of eligibility. Loyalty to the established order was reinforced by a social structure in which everyone, from the highest noble to the humblest commoner, understood precisely where they stood and what they could and could not aspire to. This system also explains something remarkable that we will encounter later in our story: Silla's willingness, at certain points in its history, to be ruled by queens. A rarity in East Asian kingdoms of this era, made possible in part because the bone rank system prioritized purity of royal bloodline over the gender of the ruler, at least under certain historical circumstances. Let this detail settle quietly into your mind. A kingdom where one's entire life, one's clothing, one's home, one's career, even the height of one's ceiling beams, was determined permanently by the circumstances of one's birth. It is a strange thing to imagine in our present age, and yet it was simply the ordinary, unquestioned fabric of daily life for the people of ancient Silla. Now let us turn to one of the most beautiful and evocative aspects of Silla's material legacy: its golden crowns, among the most extraordinary works of ancient goldsmithing found anywhere in the world. Beginning in the 4th and 5th centuries, the kings, and in the burial evidence, quite possibly certain queens and high nobility as well, of Silla were interred wearing crowns of astonishing delicacy and craftsmanship, hammered from thin sheets of pure gold and ornamented with hundreds of small, dangling gold spangles and curved jade beads shaped like commas, known in Korean as gogok. These crowns were not built for the practical business of ruling. Their thin gold bands and delicate tree-like or antler-like projections rising from the crown's base would have been far too fragile for daily wear. Most historians believe these particular crowns were funerary objects, crafted specifically to accompany the dead into the tomb, symbolic rather than functional, intended to mark the wearer's connection to sacred and cosmic authority in the afterlife, rather than to be worn at court in the ordinary business of the day. And what symbolism these crowns display! Rising from the golden band are branching, tree-like forms, along with other projections resembling antlers echoing shamanistic and cosmological beliefs found widely across ancient North Asia, in which trees and antlered creatures like deer served as symbolic bridges between the earthly world and the heavens above, between the living and the realm of spirits and ancestors. The comma-shaped jade beads, some scholars suggest, may have represented seeds or claws or drops of some vital, sacred substance. Their precise meaning debated, but their presence consistent across many of the finest crowns discovered. Imagine, for a moment, the scene of a royal burial in ancient Silla. A king or queen has died, the court has gathered in mourning. And onto the brow of the deceased, artisans place this extraordinary crown, not gold as mere wealth, but gold shaped into cosmic symbol, a tree reaching toward heaven, jade drops catching whatever light enters the burial chamber, a final, radiant declaration that this individual's authority came not merely from earthly politics, but from a connection to something sacred and eternal. These crowns remarkably survived in the ground for over 1,500 years, protected by the very tombs we will explore in our next chapter, until modern archaeologists began uncovering them in the 20th century, revealing to the world a level of ancient goldsmithing skill that rivals, and in the delicacy of its craftsmanship perhaps even exceeds, more famous golden treasures found elsewhere in the ancient world. Let us walk now through Gyeongju, the capital of Silla, as it might have appeared at the height of the kingdom's power, and let us walk too among the great mounded tombs that still rise from the earth there today, giving the modern city one of its most distinctive and haunting features. Unlike many ancient capitals where the monuments of the dead lie at a respectful distance from the homes of the living, in Gyeongju, the royal tombs rise directly among the streets and neighborhoods of the city itself, enormous grass-covered mounds, some reaching heights of over 20 meters and diameters approaching 80 meters at their base, clustered together in what is now a peaceful, park-like district at the heart of the modern town. These were not simple burial pits. Each tomb of significant status was constructed using a method now often called the wooden chamber and stone mound technique. Workers would first dig a pit and construct a wooden burial chamber within it, sometimes elaborately built, sometimes with an additional outer wooden enclosure surrounding an inner coffin. Around and above this wooden chamber, workers piled a thick layer of river stones, sometimes tens of thousands of individual stones, creating a protective barrier that would resist looting and, as it turned out, also created ideal conditions for the long-term preservation of organic materials, textiles, and delicate metalwork within. Over this stone layer, a final mound of packed earth was raised, then covered with grass, creating the smooth, dome-like hills that still rise across the Gyeongju landscape today. This particular construction method explains something remarkable about Silla's archaeological legacy. An unusually high number of these tombs were never successfully looted across the many centuries following their construction, unlike so many royal burials elsewhere in the ancient world, which suffered repeated robbery long before modern archaeologists arrived. The dense stone layer, difficult and dangerous to tunnel through, protected many of these tombs' contents intact, preserving golden crowns, jeweled belts, ceremonial swords, delicate glass vessels imported from as far away as the Mediterranean and Central Asia, and countless other objects until careful, modern excavation finally brought them back into the light. One tomb in particular deserves special mention, a mound now known as Cheonmachong, or the Heavenly Horse Tomb, named for a remarkable painting discovered within it, rendered on a piece of birch bark used as a saddle flap, depicting a white horse in vigorous, flowing motion, seemingly leaping across the heavens. This painting, one of the very few surviving pictorial artworks from ancient Silla, offers us a rare and precious glimpse of the artistic sensibility of this ancient society. Confident brushwork, a sense of energy and motion, and an evident reverence for the horse as a symbol of both earthly power and spiritual transition, an animal capable, in the belief systems of the time, of carrying the soul of the dead onward into the realms beyond. Walking among these tombs today, as visitors to Gyeongju still do, strolling along quiet paths between grassy mounds under open sky, one experiences something quite different from the towering pyramids or looming stone monuments of other ancient civilizations. There is a gentleness to these earthen hills, a soft, rounded, almost peaceful quality, even as they mark the resting places of ancient kings and queens, princes and nobles, each mound cloaked in green grass, each one guarding, in near total silence, treasures of gold and jade that lay undisturbed for a millennium and a half. For much of its early and middle history, Silla existed as one of three major kingdoms sharing the Korean peninsula, a period Korean historians refer to as the Three Kingdoms era. Understanding Silla's story requires understanding, at least in outline, its two great rivals. To the north lay Goguryeo, by far the largest of the three kingdoms in territory, controlling not only the northern portion of the Korean peninsula, but extensive lands further north as well, deep into what is now northeastern China. Goguryeo was a formidable military power, hardened by centuries of conflict along its northern frontiers with various Chinese dynasties and other steppe and forest peoples, and it possessed a proud, martial culture reflected in its distinctive tomb murals depicting warriors, hunts, and vigorous processions. To the southwest lay Baekje, a kingdom smaller than Goguryeo, but wealthy and culturally sophisticated, deeply connected by sea routes to the southern Chinese dynasties and, significantly, to the emerging states of Japan, to which Baekje transmitted, across the centuries, elements of writing, Buddhist teaching, artistic technique, and administrative practice that would profoundly shape early Japanese civilization. Silla, in its protected southeastern valley, developed more gradually than either of its rivals, absorbing cultural and technological influence from China, both directly and indirectly, often through the intermediary of its neighbors, while slowly consolidating its own internal strength. For long periods, Silla found itself the weakest of the three kingdoms, at times paying tribute or acknowledging the influence of its stronger neighbors, forming and breaking alliances as circumstances shifted, absorbing pressure from Goguryeo to the north and Baekje to the west, and facing periodic raids and tensions with the emerging Japanese state across the sea to the southeast. And yet, across the centuries, Silla proved remarkably resilient and adaptable. Its kings pursued careful diplomacy, recognizing when to ally with a neighbor and when to resist, when to accept the cultural and religious influence flowing from China's great dynasties, and when to develop distinctly Silla adaptations of foreign ideas suited to local circumstance. This patient, careful, occasionally opportunistic statecraft would eventually pay extraordinary dividends. Among the most significant transformations in Silla's long history was the gradual and initially quite difficult arrival of Buddhism. Buddhism had already taken root in both Goguryeo and Baekje by the time it began reaching Silla, carried along the same networks of diplomatic and cultural contact that connected the Korean kingdoms to China and to one another. Yet in Silla, the new faith met significant resistance, particularly from the established aristocracy, whose power and status were deeply tied to traditional shamanistic beliefs and ancestral rites, the very belief systems reflected in those tree and antler crowns we discussed earlier. Korean tradition preserves a moving, if partly legendary, account of how this resistance was eventually overcome, centered on a court official named Ichadon, who lived in the early 6th century during the reign of King Beofeng. According to this account, Ichadon, a devoted follower of the new Buddhist teaching, urged the king to formally establish Buddhism as a recognized state religion over the strong objections of the traditional aristocracy. When the aristocracy resisted fiercely, Ichadon is said to have offered his own life as proof of the faith's power, declaring that if Buddhism were indeed the true path, some miraculous sign would accompany his execution. The story tells us that when Ichadon was beheaded, his blood ran not red but white as milk, and flowers are said to have fallen from the sky in that moment, a miraculous sign that, according to tradition, finally persuaded the aristocracy and cleared the way for the king to formally adopt Buddhism as the religion of the Silla state. Whatever we make of the miraculous details preserved in this story, and every ancient culture treasures such stories, blending historical memory with symbolic meaning, the underlying historical shift was very real. From the early 6th century onward, Buddhism became deeply woven into Silla's political and cultural life, patronized generously by the royal court, expressed through the construction of increasingly magnificent temples, and eventually producing some of the most extraordinary works of Buddhist art and architecture anywhere in East Asia. This new faith did not entirely replace the older shamanistic and ancestral beliefs reflected in Silla's golden funerary crowns. Rather, across the following centuries, the two traditions existed alongside one another, blending in complex ways, so that a Silla noble might honor ancestral spirits and mountain deities in one context, and seek the teachings and protection of the Buddha in another without any deep sense of contradiction. As Buddhism flourished within Silla, so too did an extraordinary flowering of art, architecture, and craftsmanship, much of it centered in and around the capital of Gyeongju. Temples rose across the kingdom, their wooden halls, now mostly lost to time and fire, once housing serene gilt bronze images of the Buddha and various bodhisattvas, crafted with a delicacy and spiritual grace that still moves observers today in the pieces that have survived. Perhaps the most famous of these images, a seated, meditative bodhisattva cast in gilt bronze, depicts a figure lost in profound, gentle contemplation, one finger resting lightly against the cheek in a gesture of quiet inward thought. A masterpiece so serene, so exquisitely balanced between physical form and spiritual stillness that it remains celebrated today as one of the finest achievements of East Asian Buddhist sculpture. Stone craftsmanship flourished as well. Multi-tiered stone pagodas, evolving from earlier wooden pagoda traditions imported from China, developed a distinctly Korean character in Silla hands, elegant, balanced, restrained in ornamentation, built to endure, unlike wood, for many centuries. Some of these stone pagodas still stand today, weathered but essentially intact, silent witnesses to more than 1,000 years of history. Silla goldsmiths, whose skill we have already admired in the royal crowns, also produced extraordinarily fine jewelry for the living. Earrings of delicately twisted gold wire, ornate belt fittings hung with dozens of small dangling pendants representing tools, weapons, and sacred symbols, and necklaces combining gold, glass, and jade in intricate compositions. Glassware too arrived through long trade networks stretching remarkably far. Fragments and vessels found in Silla tombs have been traced, through careful chemical and stylistic analysis, to origins as distant as the Roman and Sasanian Persian worlds, carried along the great trans-Asian trade networks that linked the Mediterranean to East Asia, testament to just how far Silla's connections, whether direct or through many intermediary hands, ultimately reached. Let this image rest with you for a while. A temple courtyard at dusk, incense smoke curling upward past a serene bronze bodhisattva, a stone pagoda standing quietly nearby, its tiered roofs catching the last, low light of a Korean evening, and somewhere in the royal quarter of the city, Artisans bent over their workbenches, twisting fine gold wire by lamplight into shapes that would, centuries later, still draw quiet gasps of admiration from visitors in museum halls the world over. Among the most distinctive aspects of Silla's political history, especially when compared to neighboring societies of the same era, was its willingness, under specific circumstances dictated by the bone rank system, to place queens upon the throne in their own right, ruling not merely as consorts or regents, but as sovereign monarchs. The most celebrated of these was Queen Seondeok, who ascended to the Silla throne in the early 7th century, a period of considerable external pressure from both Baekje and Goguryeo, as well as growing entanglement in the broader politics of the Chinese mainland, then dominated by the powerful and expansive Tang dynasty. Queen Seondeok's reign is remembered for a combination of practical governance and notable cultural patronage. Among her most enduring legacies is an astronomical observatory constructed during her reign in Gyeongju, a graceful stone tower, cylindrical in shape, believed by many historians to have served as a platform for observing the heavens, tracking the movements of stars, planets, and the changing seasons, knowledge considered essential in this era, not only for agricultural planning but for the reading of celestial omens believed to carry political and spiritual significance. This tower, remarkably, still stands today in Gyeongju, one of the oldest surviving astronomical observatories in all of East Asia, a slender stone silhouette against the sky, largely unchanged across nearly 14 centuries. Queen Seondeok also oversaw the continued flourishing of Buddhist patronage within the kingdom, commissioning temples and religious works, and her reign is remembered in Korean historical tradition, alongside a handful of anecdotes suggesting a ruler noted for wisdom, foresight, and careful political judgment, qualities considered essential as Silla navigated an increasingly complex and dangerous set of relationships with its neighbors, both on the peninsula and across the sea in China. It is worth resting for a moment on the simple fact of a queen's reign in this era and context. A woman ruling in her own right, not through the fiction of regency for an absent or underage son, but as the sovereign herself, her authority rooted in the particular logic of Silla's bone rank system, which prized purity of royal descent above the more common expectation in many neighboring societies that only a man could hold ultimate sovereign power. It is a detail that quietly complicates any simple assumption about the roles available to women in ancient societies, reminding us that even within deeply hierarchical, tradition-bound kingdoms, particular circumstances could open unexpected doors. By the middle of the 7th century, the balance of power among the three Korean kingdoms had shifted decisively, and Silla, once the smallest and most cautious of the three, found itself positioned to achieve something none of its rivals ever managed: the unification of the peninsula under a single crown. This achievement did not come through Silla's strength alone. It came through a combination of skillful diplomacy, a certain amount of fortunate timing, and above all, a strategic alliance with the powerful Tang dynasty of China, then at the height of its own imperial expansion and eager to extend its influence over the Korean peninsula in cooperation with a willing local partner. Silla's leadership during this critical period, particularly under King Muyeol and his son and successor, King Munmu, pursued this alliance with careful, patient diplomacy, recognizing that Silla alone could not hope to overcome both Baekje and Goguryeo, but that Silla, combined with Tang military power, very well might. In the year 660, combined Silla and Tang forces moved against Baekje, and after fierce resistance, the kingdom fell, its royal family and much of its aristocracy scattered or captured, bringing to an end centuries of Baekje's cultured, sea-connected civilization. Several years later, in 668, combined forces turned against the far larger and more formidable kingdom of Goguryeo, weakened by years of internal succession struggles and continuous warfare along its northern frontiers, and after a long and difficult campaign, Goguryeo II finally fell. For the first time, the great majority of the Korean peninsula came under a single ruling authority, centered in Silla's ancient capital of Gyeongju. It was not, it should be said, a complete or entirely comfortable unification. Significant portions of former Goguryeo territory, particularly in the north, eventually passed instead under the control of a successor state, and Silla itself soon found it necessary to resist growing Tang ambitions to convert the newly conquered territories into direct Chinese provinces rather than allowing Silla the sovereignty it had fought for. A further period of conflict followed, this time between Silla and its former Tang allies, before Silla successfully secured its independent control over the great majority of the peninsula south of a certain northern frontier, establishing what historians now call the Unified Silla period, a time of consolidation, peace, and remarkable cultural flowering that would last for roughly 2.5 centuries. The centuries following unification marked, in many respects, the true golden age of Silla civilization, a period in which the wealth, security, and expanded territory of the unified kingdom allowed for cultural and artistic achievements even more magnificent than those of the earlier Three Kingdoms period. Gyeongju itself grew into a truly grand capital city, laid out, according to later historical descriptions, along an orderly grid pattern reflecting Chinese urban planning principles, its streets lined with tiled roof houses for the wealthy, its markets filled with goods gathered from across the unified peninsula and beyond, its temples and palaces rebuilt and expanded on a grander scale than ever before. Among the most extraordinary achievements of this era stands a temple complex known as Bulguksa, along with an associated grotto sanctuary called Seokguram, both constructed in the 8th century under royal patronage, and both counted today among the most treasured cultural landmarks of Korea. Bulguksa's stone terraces, staircases, and pagodas display a masterful combination of engineering precision and aesthetic grace, its stonework so finely fitted that many of its foundation walls have required little repair across more than 1,000 years. Nearby, the Seokguram Grotto houses a serene, larger-than-life granite image of the Buddha, seated in perfect meditative composure within a carefully engineered domed stone chamber, positioned so that, according to careful astronomical calculation by its ancient builders, it gazes out across the mountains toward the distant sea at a particular alignment believed to hold deep symbolic and protective significance for the kingdom. This period also produced one of the most remarkable technological and artistic achievements of ancient Korea, an enormous bronze bell cast in the 8th century of such size and acoustic sophistication that its deep, resonant tone was said to carry for great distances across the surrounding countryside, a sound many contemporary observers described in terms of profound spiritual and emotional power. Later folklore surrounding this bell, involving a tragic legend of a child sacrificed during its casting to achieve the perfect tone, speaks to the deep emotional resonance such an object held in the popular imagination, even if the historical reality of the bell's creation lies, as with so much of ancient history, somewhere between careful metallurgical skill and the embellishments of later storytelling. Trade and diplomatic contact flourished as well during this period. Silla maintained close relations with Tang China, sending scholars, monks, and officials to study at the Tang capital, absorbing administrative techniques, literary traditions, and further waves of Buddhist teaching, which Silla scholars and monks would, in turn, further refine and develop, producing distinguished Buddhist philosophers and translators whose works traveled back across the sea to influence Chinese Buddhist thought as well, a rare instance of intellectual influence flowing in both directions along these ancient networks. Silla ships and merchants, meanwhile, maintained a substantial maritime trading network across the Yellow Sea and beyond, and in this era, a celebrated Silla maritime figure named Yangbogo, established a significant naval and trading base that for a time exercised considerable control over shipping routes across the region, illustrating the kingdom's continued deep connection to the sea that had shaped so much of its earlier history. As with every great civilization we have explored on this channel, Silla's long golden age eventually began, gradually and unevenly, to fade. By the 9th century, the very bone-rank system that had once provided such remarkable internal stability began instead to generate mounting tension. As centuries passed, the pool of individuals holding the highest sacred bone status gradually narrowed through the accidents of successive generations, eventually disappearing altogether, forcing adjustments to succession practices that opened the door to increasingly contested and unstable transitions of power. Meanwhile, talented individuals of lower rank, denied access to positions commensurate with their abilities, regardless of merit, grew increasingly resentful of a system that offered them no meaningful path forward, fueling social discontent that simmered beneath the kingdom's outward splendor. At the same time, powerful regional lords and military strongmen, operating increasingly independently of the weakening central court in Gyeongju, began carving out their own spheres of local power across the provinces, offering protection and patronage in exchange for loyalty, in a pattern familiar to historians of many declining ancient states. Peasant unrest, driven by heavy taxation and the burdens of court extravagance, added further pressure to an increasingly fractured political landscape. By the early 10th century, these accumulated pressures had fractured the unified kingdom into what historians now call the later Three Kingdoms period, as rival warlords established competing states, each claiming legitimate authority over portions of the former Silla territory. The royal court in Gyeongju, its power reduced to little more than the immediate region surrounding the ancient capital, could do little to resist this fragmentation. Finally, in the year 935, the last king of Silla, recognizing the hopelessness of his kingdom's position amid these overwhelming pressures, chose to formally surrender his throne and territory to Wang Geon, the founder of a new unifying dynasty known as Goryeo, a name from which many centuries later the modern word Korea itself would ultimately derive. It was, in many respects, a remarkably graceful ending for such an ancient kingdom, not a violent conquest, but a considered political transition, the last king choosing peaceful surrender over prolonged and likely futile resistance, preserving what dignity and continuity he could for his people and his ancient royal lineage. Nearly 1,000 years of continuous history, from those first legendary village chiefs in the Gyeongju Valley through the golden age of unification and its slow subsequent fracturing, came, in this quiet and considered act, to its formal close. Today, the ancient capital of Gyeongju is sometimes described, with only slight exaggeration, as a museum without walls. The city and its surrounding countryside remain scattered with the physical legacy of Silla's long history. The grass-covered royal tombs rising gently among modern streets, their golden crowns and jeweled treasures now carefully preserved in nearby museums. The slender stone astronomical observatory built under Queen Seondeok, still standing largely intact after nearly 14 centuries. The graceful stone terraces and pagodas of Bulguksa Temple, rebuilt after later damage, but still resting upon their original, masterfully engineered foundations. The serene granite Buddha of Seokguram Grotto, still gazing in quiet contemplation toward the distant sea. The influence of Silla's unification also extends more subtly, but no less significantly, into the entire subsequent course of Korean history. The peninsula's later dynasties, and indeed the modern nations that occupy Korean territory today, trace a continuous historical thread back through Goryeo to this ancient unification achieved in the 7th century, the first time the great majority of the Korean people found themselves gathered under a single, political roof, a foundational moment in the long story of Korean national identity. The artistic and religious traditions nurtured within Silla, its distinctive Buddhist sculpture and temple architecture, its refined goldsmithing techniques, its poetic and literary traditions recorded in early forms of Korean writing, continued to influence Korean culture across the subsequent Goryeo and Joseon dynasties and remain visible today in the broader artistic heritage of the Korean peninsula. And the golden crowns themselves, lifted so carefully from beneath their protective mounds of river stone in the 20th century, now rest in quiet museum halls, their delicate branches and dangling jade beads no longer catching the torchlight of an ancient burial chamber, but instead the soft, even light of climate-controlled display cases where visitors from around the world now pause, as we have paused together tonight, to marvel at the patient, remarkable civilization that shaped them. As we come to the end of this long journey, let your mind rest on the image of that mountain-ringed valley in the southeastern corner of the Korean peninsula, where a small, cautious kingdom grew slowly across many centuries, absorbing pressure from stronger neighbors, developing its own distinctive rank of gods and ancestors and Buddhist teachings side by side. Let yourself picture the golden crowns, their delicate branches reaching upward like small sacred trees, jade beads catching whatever light still reaches them in their earthen chambers, resting undisturbed for a millennium and a half beneath their careful covering of river stone. Let yourself picture Queen Seondok gazing up at the night sky from the base of her newly built stone observatory, reading in the slow wheel of the stars some guidance for the careful governance of her uncertain, contested age. Let yourself picture the quiet, considered surrender of the last king of Silla, choosing peace over ruin, allowing his ancient kingdom to pass gently into a new dynasty rather than be destroyed by needless resistance. And let yourself picture, finally, the grassy mounds that still rise today among the streets of modern Gyeongju, gentle green hills holding, beneath their quiet surface, the golden and jade treasures of a civilization that patiently, carefully, across nearly 1,000 years, grew from a handful of mountain villages into the kingdom that first unified an entire peninsula. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, drifting through the valleys and tombs of ancient Silla. If you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing to the channel so that more stories like this one can find their way to you in the quiet hours when you need them most. Rest now. Let the golden crowns settle back into the darkness of their earthen chambers. Let the temple bells fade into silence. Let the ancient kingdom drift gently beyond the edge of memory. Sleep well, and good night.